Media Manager. I will be moderating this session. I request all of you to kindly keep your audio on mute so that there is no disturbance during the conversation. Towards the end of the session, if you have any questions, please send them to us through the chat box. Today, we are going to be discussing wildlife conservation laws in India with a distinguished conservationist, Mr. Praveen Bhargav. Mr. Bhargav has been involved in wildlife conservation activities since 1982. He is the co-founder of Wildlife First, a proactive wildlife advocacy group is established in 1995, and he serves as its managing trustee. Mr. Bhargav has also served on various committees of the Ministry of Environment. The Sanctuary magazine presented the 2006 Wildlife Service Award for his efforts to protect and secure Karnataka's wildlife and forests. Mr. Bhargav also writes regularly on conservation policy and issues in the media. Sir, thank you very much for making time for this webinar. We are delighted to have you again with us.
My pleasure.
So I guess, so I'll start with my first question to you.
Sure.
How is wildlife defined by the law?
Okay. Now, what I would like to tell everybody is that there are two terms used in the law, and I'll keep everything as simple as possible. I won't complicate any of the legal issues so that everybody can understand. And in case you still have any doubts, you can always ask a question through chat or whatever, and we'll try to clarify it at the end of the talk. Okay. There are two terms, wildlife and wild animal. It is used interchangeably in the law, or rather in different sections of the law, the term is used whether wild animal is required there, for instance, when it comes to hunting or when it comes to wildlife. The definition is very simple. A wild animal is defined under the law as any mammal, reptile, amphibian, bird, etc., but listed in the 4 schedules of the Wildlife Protection Act. In other words, only those animals which are listed in the 4 schedules of the Wildlife Act are designated or have the meaning of wild animal. Wildlife, on the other hand, not only includes animals, but it also includes its habitat. So wildlife has a much larger meaning and definition, and it includes animals and its habitat. So this is the distinction that is made in the law. But while writing or talking in popular fora, do use it interchangeably. But here we need to be aware of it. There is another terminology which I want to inform your viewers, which is there is another term called captive animal. A captive animal is a wild animal held in captivity. A captive animal does not include domesticated species like a dog or a cattle or a livestock or whatever it is. For instance, an elephant. An elephant can be in a temple, can be in a zoo, or can be in the wild. So an elephant in a temple is a captive animal. Whereas if it's in the wild, it's a wild animal. So that's the difference. So captive animal and wild animal. And the act, if I can add to what I've just now said, broadly, the protection accorded to wild animals differs slightly. Those animals, by animals I mean it includes birds, reptiles, etc. Those animals which are listed in Schedule 1 and or Part 2 of Schedule 2 have the highest status, because you cannot hunt. If you hunt those animals, you will face a compulsory imprisonment term of a minimum of 3 years, which can extend to 7 years. Whereas in case of animals listed in Schedule 3 and 4, if it is hunted outside a sanctuary or a national park, there is an option to also compound the offense, which means that you can impose a fine and let the person go. But this is the difference. So the Act is constructed in such a way that wild animals listed in Schedule 1 and Part 2 of Schedule 2 have the highest degree of protection. So that's the difference between wild animal, captive animal, and wildlife.
Right. So, could you please help us understand the differences between various types of reserved forests and on what criteria are they based on?
Yeah. Now, what I will do is I'll request Ishika to share her screen with the first slide, the graphic, and then I'll explain to your audience how it works. Can we have the first slide, please?
Sure, one moment. Yes, is this visible?
Can we get it on full screen, please? Yeah, it's loading.
Is this fine?
I'm not able to see it. It's still, it says loading. Yeah, got it.
Oh, okay. It's
yeah, it's visible now.
It's okay. Okay. So, Saurabha, it's like this. Forests were notified starting from 1878, when the Indian Forest Act of 1878 was first enacted. And subsequently, in 1927, the Act was amended and forest areas were notified as reserved forests. This was the first notification or legal protection accorded to forests, that is natural forests, by the government. Now, what typically is the process is that the Indian Forest Act specifies a certain procedure before an area is notified as a forest. And this starts with a notification under Section 4 and ends with a notification under Section 18, whereby the reserve forest is finally notified. Now, all forest areas notified under the Indian Forest Act are reserved forests. Now, there is a big debate today about local people and people who are traditionally living in forests and whose rights were not settled, etc. But let me tell your audience that this is a very, very detailed process that was traversed before the forest notifications were issued. And interestingly, and Mr. Shyam Sundar and Mr. Parameshwarappa have covered it in detail in their book. Interestingly, more than what area was taken up for forest was left for the community. In fact, in some places, if 100 square kilometers was taken up as reserved forests, 400 square kilometers, up to 400 square kilometers was left out. What has happened to those forests? They are all gone, and now we are dipping into the last remaining bits of notified forests. So to say that there was no legal procedure when rights were settled is a wholly incorrect idea, and it is bereft of factual, it is not a factually correct. Now, so reserved forests were constituted, and state forests. What are state forests? Many people may not know the difference between a state forest and a reserved forest. Simply speaking, as I put it on the slide, state forests are those forests which are notified under state acts. Now, even the Indian Forest Act, it is the state government which has to use the powers that they have under the Indian Forest Act to notify reserve forests, because let your audience know, many of them may already know, that land is a state subject. Central government cannot notify a reserved forest or a state forest. It is always the state government which does it. It does it either under the Indian Forest Act or under the State Forest Act. For instance, the Karnataka Forest Act 1963. And every state has a state act similar to the Indian Forest Act.
Right.
So with that notification, which happened turn of the century and onwards, the Wildlife Protection Act came about in 1972. And after 1972, what state governments did was that the Wildlife Protection Act empowered state governments to notify national parks and sanctuaries. And what happened is that 3, 4, or 5 contiguous reserved forests or state forests were amalgamated and a notification was issued. The original notification as a reserved forest does not dissipate. It remains. It is an overlapping notification as a national park or sanctuary. Now, in case of a sanctuary, the reserved forest notification being in place, and if you're notifying only reserved forests or state forest as the case may be, you can straight away notify it as a sanctuary without going through any further process. In other words, the final notification of the sanctuary can be issued if the area to be taken up for the sanctuary includes only reserved forests. Now, there will be a question in the minds of your audience that there may be certain rights which may have been allowed in the reserved forests. For instance, rights over land, rights for grazing, right of way, etc. So what the governments do is that in case of a sanctuary, those rights will continue till it is settled. Whereas in a national park, and this is one of the differences between a national park and a sanctuary, no rights can be allowed in a national park. So therefore, the Wildlife Act specifies a procedure for acquisition of such rights. And all acquisition of rights under the Wildlife Protection Act is deemed to be for a public purpose. Putting it simply, it is like acquisition for a highway. If my property is in the way, the government will acquire it. I cannot object to it. This principle is called as eminent domain in law. I don't want to go into the details, but I can only litigate for better compensation. So it is deemed to be an acquisition for a public purpose. So therefore, in case of a national park, all rights have to be acquired. And of course, if you have legal rights, it will be settled. There are guidance values and so forth. There's a new law called as right to fair compensation, etc. And the national park is constituted. It starts from section 35(1) and ends at 35(4) when the area is fully constituted as a national park after settlement of all rights. Then come tiger reserves. Now, tiger reserves are also areas which are part of national parks and sanctuaries. So, in other words, just like overlapping notification over a reserved forest was issued to create sanctuaries and national parks, yet another overlapping notification is issued over the national parks and sanctuaries under 38(v)(4) of the Wildlife Protection Act, notifying it as a tiger reserve, core or critical tiger habitat of a tiger reserve. So again, let me reiterate that none of the previous notifications vanish or dissipate. They continue. So an area can be a reserved forest, it can also be a national park, and it can be a tiger reserve. And let me point out that all tiger reserves notified in the country today comprise only of national parks and sanctuaries. That is the core critical tiger habitat. Then there are buffer zones for tiger reserves. Typically, these are reserved forests which were not taken up as a sanctuary or a national park, and they can constitute a buffer zone, or they can be other government land. They are what are called as revenue land or deemed forests and so forth, where deemed forest is nothing but areas that have forest cover and fall within the dictionary meaning of forest, but they have not been officially notified as a reserved forest or a state forest. So such areas which have corridor value or which can buffer the impacts from human settlements and so forth can be notified as a buffer zone. And in our context in India, you may not have a wraparound buffer zone around a tiger reserve. It would be ideal, but it is not possible. For instance, those who are from Madhya Pradesh would know that Kanha, the core itself is 1,000 square kilometers, and you have a buffer of about another 1,000 or 1,500 square kilometers. But in many places, that's not the situation, and we do not have the luxury of having a complete wraparound buffer zone. And that is the reason why it was decided that we create what are called as eco-sensitive zones. Eco-sensitive zones can include private land, it can include multiple use lands, it can include even agricultural lands. Because the eco-sensitive zone is notified under the Environment Protection Act, as I have indicated, and under the Environment Protection Act, the government does not have the power to acquire any land. It can only restrict land use, or it can impose what should be the land use in that area. So what happens is that there are three regimes: prohibited, regulated, and permissible. All agricultural activity fall in the permissible regime. For instance, resorts, wildlife resorts and so forth, they fall in the regulated category. And activities like mining and thermal power plants fall in the prohibited category. So that is the eco-sensitive zone. And for an eco-sensitive zone, you can have a wraparound eco-sensitive zone around the tiger reserve. The last point that I want to, or category that I want to highlight, is critical wildlife habitat. This is notified under the Forest Rights Act. There's another law called as the Forest Rights Act. I know some of this may be confusing to people, but I'm trying to simplify it to the extent possible. So critical wildlife habitat is notified under the Forest Rights Act, and it is kind of similar to critical tiger habitats. And let me not go into further details on that. So essentially, to sum up, we have reserved forests, national park sanctuaries, tiger reserves, buffer zones of tiger reserves, and eco-sensitive zones. As such, till now, not a single critical wildlife habitat has been notified. So therefore, let's not get into that. So the area of national parks and sanctuaries in the country is about 4.5% of India's land area. In terms of reserved forests, though the national goal is fixed at 33, it's impractical. We have about 20% under reserved forests and state forests. All of it is not in good shape. And about 10% of these areas truly have some component of, are intact to a fairly large extent. And really intact areas, we are down to about 2% or 3%. So we need to be very, very careful. So please don't go by the data that circulates and government brings out what is called as the Forest Survey of India report and all that. So several experts have critiqued it, and it can be quite misleading. So essentially, let me conclude by saying, and people have seen this slide. So this is the structure and the different regimes applicable in these areas apply. Do you want me to also explain the other differences between a national park and sanctuary quickly?
Yes, please. Sure.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Now, I have asked this question even in workshops that I do for enforcement officers, forest officers, and it is not very clear. So there are three differences between a sanctuary and a national park. The first difference, as I told you earlier, is that in a sanctuary, certain rights can be allowed in consultation with the Chief Wildlife Warden, whereas in a national park, it has to be acquired and fully settled. This is first and an important difference. The second difference is that in a sanctuary, the Chief Wildlife Warden can allow certain grazing in certain areas, grazing by livestock in certain areas, provided the livestock is immunized so that it doesn't spread any disease to wild herbivores. Whereas in a national park, it's completely prohibited. So any cattle that you see grazing inside a national park is illegal and action has to be taken. Whereas in a sanctuary, it could be legal, it could be illegal. That is the second difference. The third difference is that a national park can be upgraded, a sanctuary can be upgraded to a national park. A national park can't be downgraded to a sanctuary. So therefore, other than these three differences, all the provisions of the Wildlife Act are the same with respect to sanctuaries and national parks. In case of a tiger reserve, there is an additional layer of protection, which is minor. It says that interconnected areas between two national parks and sanctuaries or tiger reserves should not be diverted for incompatible uses till the National Tiger Conservation Authority evaluates it. So, which means that if you have a railway line or a highway or whatever cutting through a corridor between two tiger reserves, because tigers, as we know, need large landscapes and they move around. So in such cases, under section 3801G, there is a restriction, and that acts as an additional protective layer to ensure that habitats remain connected. So these are the differences.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, your audio is not clear.
So my
No.
can you hear me now?
Oh.
Okay. So my next question to you is related to the last point you just made. What do you think of the infrastructure development projects that pose threats to our wildlife and habitats across India, and how can we find alternative solutions to this?
It's a very important issue that we need to look at seriously. The problem in the country today is that, as I said earlier, we have about 4% of India under the protected area network. So the fundamental question which decision makers in the country must be asked is that if India has not been able to achieve development and deliver social justice to people using 96% of its landscape, can any dent be made on that problem by diverting or indiscriminately diverting the last remaining bits of national parks and sanctuaries and tiger reserves? So we need to look at this very, very carefully. And in fact, there is a real good body of scientific knowledge and evidence to say that, which shows that fragmentation of habitat by development projects, caused by development projects like linear intrusions like highways, pipelines, power lines, etc., or indiscriminate grant of land for mining in crucial areas, or other development projects, is the single biggest driver of biodiversity loss. The whole idea that the government is now pursuing with respect to development projects of saying, okay, we'll take 10 hectares of land here, we'll plant 20 hectares elsewhere. It is one of the most ridiculous ideas which has to be junked, but repeated warnings by scientific community, by conservationists, etc., has made no dent on policy, including the current national forest policy, which is under debate. This is hugely unfortunate. And this whole idea of compensatory afforestation, of saying I'll plant some trees somewhere, is kind of a very convenient method by which the government is trying to divert or mislead the nation in terms of what it is doing for forest conservation. Now, the Forest Conservation Act itself, when it comes to evaluation of development projects, specifies that only such projects which are site specific in nature. Let me illustrate what is site specific. For instance, there is an ore body. Let's take the case of uranium. It is a strategic mineral and it is not abundantly available as opposed to, say, granite or iron ore or whatever. And the ore body is located at a certain point. Whereas there are other components of that project which can be located outside. So the Forest Conservation Act specifies that only site-specific projects must be allowed. But all this is not really being followed, and projects are getting clearance in a very, very simplified process. And as I have published and stated earlier, ease of doing business has become the main business of the Ministry of Environment. See, the Ministry of Environment should act as a brake, a powerful brake. Development ministries are like the engine. Yes, they press on the throttle and they want economic development. We do need economic development. I'm not saying no. But then it is the job, the constitutional and the legal mandate of the ministry to put brakes on certain projects which are destructive. Today, the clearance rates for under the Forest Conservation Act and the Wildlife Protection Act have reached almost 99%. Hardly any project is being rejected. So this is a worrisome situation. At the same time, let me say that we in the conservation community must also act responsibly and not oppose everything that is proposed. And the other thing is, conservation movement is going through a transition. We need to propose and come up with credible alternatives and solutions, which will say, oh, I don't want anything. No. We said, don't do it at location A. It can be done reasonably well at location B. It will minimize the impact by X%. It will minimize it by 50, 60 or whatever percent. Or for example, if we as a conservationist can highlight that there is a road proposed, but there is also an existing highway. And if we can show that this is a redundant parallel alignment within 5 or 8 kilometers of an existing alignment, it is not just going to cause ecological damage. It is also going to harm the country economically. For instance, let's take the case of Hubli-Ankola Railway.
Yeah.
There is an existing railway line connecting Hubli to Ankola. And that also has been developed at a cost to the environment. The Konkan Railway has also been developed at a cost to the environment. Now there is connectivity. It is not that there is no railway connectivity between Hubli and Ankola. What is being proposed now is another alignment, a railway alignment, which is just 50 kilometers south of the existing alignment. Now, these are redundant projects. So we need to act very carefully, and decision makers must be made aware of the redundancy of such projects, particularly now in the post-COVID economic scenario and so forth. But the problem is that these are highly lucrative projects and people want it. There are lobbies that operate 24 hours trying to push for these projects. So we as conservationists need to address it carefully, and we need to take it on, and sometimes we need to go to courts. So I won't digress, but the point remains that we are not opposed to, many sensible conservationists are not opposed to development per se. We are opposed to such redundant projects or non-site specific projects which can be done elsewhere but are intruding into pristine areas, and we need a fair amount of scientific evaluation. And unfortunately, the Forest Advisory Committee, which evaluates these projects, and the National Board for Wildlife, which looks into these aspects, is ignoring these aspects. So therefore, we need to have a credible National Board for Wildlife and a Forest Advisory Committee and Environment Appraisal Committees to really apply and ensure that projects are properly evaluated and permission is granted only to such projects, deserving projects, which are required for economic development of the country. And there are, if it is completely unavoidable, credible mitigation measures. For instance, in the case of highways, where an alternative alignment is just not available, you need to look at a suite of other options, which could be overpasses, underpasses, design of culverts, because you're not just talking of tigers and elephants. You're talking of a range of wild animals, and each one's requirements are pretty different. So therefore, there are these. For instance, in the case of power lines, all you need to do is overcome 6, 8, or 12 kilometers, which is a critical wildlife area. And you can have along an existing highway an underground cable, 400 kV underground cables are available. So you need to use such technology also in certain cases to mitigate or reduce the impact when the intrusion itself is unavoidable. So therefore, we need to think along these lines and ensure that credible solutions are presented in the public domain and shared with decision makers. And that's how we need to address this. And the government must be pressurized, and it is the bounden right, it is the fundamental right of every citizen guaranteed under the Constitution to take up these matters. So please, nobody should feel overawed or say that you may be there are people who will say, I've been accused of being anti-national. That's okay. But I am doing my constitutional duty and in good faith. And we are all patriots, and we all want the country to save its forests, because that's a national asset that we are trying to defend. And the Constitution of India enjoins us to do it. So therefore, please don't think that you are not empowered. You are, and it is your right to question the government on policies. I mean, in the sense that you should keep the debate civil, not digress into defamatory and other things which is currently happening. So keep it civil, stick to your point, gather all the data, and raise your points to defend wildlife and forests.
Thank you, sir. My next question is also related to what you just explained, kind of an addendum to the previous question. So there are a lot of misconceptions about wildlife and human-wildlife interactions, right? And there is a flurry of unscientific opinions and fake news that gets passed on social media, especially at an alarming rate. So how do we sensitize people to listen to experts and then give out their opinions and go about it?
As you yourself said, social media and other things, everybody has a right to express his or her opinion. So that is something which nobody can control.
Yeah.
But at the same time, experienced conservationists, organizations or networks, which have a collective of various organizations and individuals, need to first understand the leadership within these groups must try to educate young conservationists or inexperienced conservationists and try to put out good information, science-based information in public domain. Let us take the case of Maharashtra and Avni. There was a big hue and cry when it came to a very, very serious situation in terms of so many people being killed by tigers in a particular area in Maharashtra. Now, on the one hand, we had conservationists and scientists who said that, yes, the problem animal has to be captured or eliminated. On the other hand, you had people representing other views who said no, at no cost should the tiger be captured. Now, this is where wildlife conservation and animal rights part ways. Animal rights is an extremely important and is really important to the country, but we need to deal with these subtle or important aspects carefully. For instance, it will become impossible to protect wildlife, because what happens is the goal of wildlife conservation is to protect the species as a whole in its natural habitat. Say, for example, tigers or elephants, as the case may be. And since I said earlier that we have about 4% of India for endangered species, the rights of endangered species must prevail in those areas. Now, when these kind of persistent conflict situations emerge, it is important from the perspective of saving tigers in that area to resolve the conflict, because otherwise public support will diminish and diminish very badly. And then there may be a situation where law and order will collapse. People will go inside national parks. It has happened, and they will start killing animals, setting fire to forests. And of course, the first target is the forest staff. They get beaten up. The local timber mafias, the local hunting mafias use such opportunities of conflict to settle scores with the forest department. They burn forest infrastructure and so forth. So this becomes an intractable situation. So we need to deal with it very, very carefully. And groups are working to educate local people on how to deal with conflict situations, particularly with respect to large carnivores like tigers or large animals like elephants. Let me also put another perspective to human-wildlife conflict. We talk of human deaths, which is the most serious impact. Property can be compensated. A death cannot be compensated because a loved member of the family is lost forever. Yet, if you pull back, there are such unfortunate deaths caused by a variety of things in society. It is caused by road accidents, it's caused by terrorism, fires, what have you. So human deaths, unfortunate that we all accept, is not the only thing caused by wildlife. It is caused by other aspects also. And if you take the numbers of human deaths caused due to human-wildlife conflict, it is much less compared to road accidents. So we need to see this in perspective also. So therefore, there are no set formulas or solutions to address this. Yes, we as conservationists should reach out and try to explain these things to people, both at the local level also. There are some situations where you can permanently resolve conflicts by spatially separating humans and wildlife. For instance, there is a settlement deep inside, and they are having a lot of cattle kills, and elephants are coming and grazing whatever crop that they are raising. It is a conflict situation. So by offering voluntary resettlement to that remote settlement inside a national park, it should be fair, the compensation should be correct, and the local people must also be involved. And in many cases, they would be happy to accept it, as several case studies show in the country. That will resolve the conflict permanently, and that area will be free of human pressure. So it's a win-win solution for both people and wildlife. In some cases, you cannot resolve it. You can minimize it to a certain extent. So we need to look at each site-specific situation carefully. And in some cases, like, for example, in the case of Avni, wildlife may suffer, an individual animal may have to be removed. But that is the only way you can resolve that conflict. But the larger goal of tiger conservation will be ensured. Then there are situations in human wildlife conflict where there are mobs chasing animals. The animal is already stressed and an elephant or a tiger can run amok. So we need to sensitize people. See, the biggest reason why people do get killed due to these conflicts is that they get too close to wild animals. They don't realize, and then it's too late. So maintaining distance between wild animals, and if people stay clear, that itself will reduce the probability of any untoward incidents. And it will also allow the forest department to go and capture that animal. Otherwise, the animal will, it becomes very, very difficult for somebody to launch a capture operation. So therefore, these are things that it's a big subject. We can go on and on, but these are the things which there's a lot of material available in the public domain, and people can educate themselves. So these are the fundamentals, in the sense that spatially separating humans and wildlife can give us relief. In some cases, you may have to remove the wild animal or a group of wild animals because it has no way it can survive in that area, as in the case of Hassan with respect to elephants. And in some cases, you need to deal with it as the situation evolves. You need to educate the local people, seek their support. And the last point which I want to say is that the government must ensure, and we organizations, conservation groups must ensure, just like Wild Survey is doing, that you need to go out and ensure that compensation is delivered to the people as quickly as possible. And therefore, these are important. So there is a suite of solutions, and we need to fall back on one of these depending on the situation.
Right. So we have some really amazing questions coming up. But before that, I just have last two questions for you. And if you could answer precisely, that would be great. My next question is, how can we get the local communities to benefit more economically from activities such as ecotourism?
Yeah, it's a very valid and an important issue. And in short, I can say that there are tremendous opportunities available, because what happens is you can convert a conflict situation like what we just now discussed into a potential revenue earning proposal or a project for the local communities. For instance, there are lands abutting a national park. We have hard edges, and a lot of animals stray inside. Stray outside the national park into private lands. Some of them may even be forested lands, or some may have tree growth. So changing the land use over a period of time and involving the community and sharing tourism revenues with the local communities can be. In Nepal, it's been tried, in some other places it's been tried. And this is a very, very important activity that needs to be encouraged. It is also, they call it rewilding. People have tried this, it has worked. But only thing is, equitable sharing of profits from tourism revenues is very, very important. See, also we must realize that this is quite a sensitive subject, because the local people are stopped, whereas we people from the towns and cities come in swanky vehicles and try to enter the park. There is a certain amount of resentment. So therefore, if equitable mechanisms to ensure revenue sharing with the local people, for example, the forest department has a mechanism of tiger conservation foundations, eco development committees, so forth. So in fact, the conflict can be largely minimized. You can add buffer areas. There are many, many mechanisms available. In fact, I've published some of this. It's on our website. People can go and read it. So in short, it is very important to have equitable revenue sharing mechanisms with local communities through tourism, which will help wildlife.
Thank you, sir. The last question from my side to you is, what is your message to conservation enthusiasts?
My message is, don't feel despondent. It is a tough fight, no doubt, but you need to peg away. You should not give up. And you are fully empowered in our country, as I said earlier, under the Constitution, and it is your legal right to fight. There are many other causes that people do take up, whether it is child rights, human rights, etc. So fighting for forests and wildlife, campaigning for forests and wildlife is important. But I want to tell you or share with you that there are a few things that you need to know. One, please do get into conservation and take up conservation campaigns which are grounded in proper scientific knowledge and data. Because if you take up issues without understanding the nuances of conservation, the chances of success are low. And what happens is that if you fail 2 or 3 times, then you feel demotivated. So please don't do that. Consult people. And I always believe that knowledge about wildlife conservation is not licensed software. It's a freeware. So through CWS, through other organizations, I'm doing some webinars and trying to share whatever little I can share so that conservationists are empowered. So data, knowledge, scientific knowledge, again linked to fake news that you had raised earlier, is hugely important, and that should form the foundations of your campaign to save something. Second is you need to be sincere and have high integrity. Now, unfortunately, in Bangalore and in some few other places, some people are converting this into a credit-seeking and publicity circus. This is not that. It's a public issue of immense importance. And rushing to court with a PIL, thinking that you will get your 2 column centimeters in the media or your bite in television. No, because you will be doing the cause a great disservice if you're going with frivolous issues to court. So please ensure that you collate data. And before you go to court, approach the statutory authorities and seek redressal of your grievance. Because in many cases, it can be stopped at that level itself. You don't have to go to court. So you need to go step by step in terms of your campaigning. And if all else fails, then you should approach courts. So this is another important thing. And when you take up campaigns, please ensure that you cannot have a disconnect. Conservation is more like politics. The situation in the morning will dramatically change by evening. So if you're saying I'm going to do conservation only on Sunday, yeah, you can do it, but somebody in the group must anchor it right through. Otherwise, what happens is that you can't. Then the other thing is, to be a conservationist, you need not be an ecologist or a lawyer or whatever. You have, many of you who have connected today have various skills. Some of you may be very good at writing. Some of you may be very good in GIS, or software. And some may be very good going out and meeting people, talking to politicians. And some people may have a lot of links with bureaucrats. You may come from a family of bureaucrats or politicians, so on and so forth. So you can pull all that for conservation. And some people have that flair, so you can do that. So apart from ecologists and conservationists, full-time conservationists, many people can contribute by writing, by speaking, public talks, or specialized skills like GIS and so forth, and contribute for conservation. So there are many ways you can do it, but you must ensure that this is a long, it is not a T20 match. IPL is going on, I know, and 7:30 IPL starts, and many of you may be tuning in. This is not a T20 game. This is a long haul. It is a test match, it's a marathon. So you need to be at it. And I'm pretty certain that if you approach it in the manner that we just now spoke, you will see success and you will be enthused to work for conservation.
That was really inspiring, sir. Thank you very much. I'll start with a very interesting question we have from Anubhav. Anubhav asks, why does the judiciary not oppose clearances which go against written wildlife laws? Who is responsible for the opposition and why isn't action taken against this veto?
No, judiciary has, in fact, to the extent that people have targeted the judiciary and said this kind of interference in stopping projects is judicial overreach. The Godavarman case is on from 12/12/96 in the apex court of the country, and more than 1,500 applications have been entertained and a series of orders have been passed stopping projects, interfering, diverting projects outside, questioning governments, and so forth. In fact, Kudremukh is a case in point where we approached the court and the court stopped a very large mining project because it was violating wildlife laws. So therefore, many directions, in fact, the eco-sensitive zones that we talked about are happening because of a court order. Mm-hmm. So the court is interfering, is questioning and ensuring. In fact, the court has expanded the definition or the meaning of right to life, which is a fundamental right of every citizen under Article 21. And it has reinterpreted right to life as to include right to clean ecology and environment. So therefore, the courts, the constitutional courts have done a tremendous amount of service for wildlife conservation. Yes, we are passing through a phase where we do feel, and Anubhav is right, in terms of saying that so many things are happening which are negative to conservation. But I'm pretty certain that, and people are questioning, going to courts and questioning projects. Courts are entertaining petitions, but then there is a time lag. We feel frustrated. Sometimes orders don't come. Sometimes the petitions are not properly drafted. So there are a whole lot of issues. But certainly the court is, when it is properly pointed out that a certain project is completely violative of law, courts do interfere, courts do stop and exercise their extraordinary judicial powers to remedy the situation.
The next question is from Shankar. Shankar asks, WPA provides power to police as well to investigate wildlife offences. From National Crime Records Bureau statistics, we may infer that police are hesitant to investigate wildlife cases. Why do police not actively take up wildlife cases for investigation?
Yeah, good question. Yes, you're right that both police and forest have concurrent jurisdiction under the Wildlife Protection Act. And police are fully empowered to investigate and deal with wildlife offences. There are procedural differences in the way the police will have to take up the matter versus forests. So I will not go into those details. The point here is, yes, you talked of National Crime Records Bureau and so forth, but a lot of cases are registered by the police, but the police in the country are stretched. They have huge pressure and they have multifarious duties. So wildlife is not a top priority for them. Ensuring law and order and dealing with a whole lot of other issues. And they are stressed, they are understaffed, and there are many other problems. So therefore, but then we have found that whenever we have gone to the police, they have responded, they have booked cases, and there are many cases filed by the police which are also resulting in prosecution. Mm-hmm. But then overall, the investigation quality can improve. There are other procedural aspects where there are certain gaps, there's lack of knowledge and so forth. But to conclude, let me say that police do take up wildlife offences. In fact, sometimes they do it far more efficiently than the forest department because they have investigation skills which are better than forest officers, and they understand the code of criminal procedure, which is very important for prosecuting offenders. So that's how it is. But and let me just add one last point. There is no need for any additional increase in penalties or powers. They are more than enough. Implementation of the law is what is required.
Yes. Thank you, sir. We have a question from Asta, which is very relevant. Floods have caused a lot of habitat loss this year. How are losses of flora and fauna managed every year in such situations? Is her question.
Okay. See, habitat loss caused due to natural calamities is very different from habitat loss caused due to indiscriminate pushing of development projects or whatever, or for instance, construction of a dam at an inappropriate location, submerging some habitat and so forth. Now, whenever habitat damage happens due to natural causes, it is not as worrisome as what happens with respect to man-made disasters. Now, in many cases, the two could be interlinked. For example, in Coorg recently, an entire hillock slid because forest department had gone and used heavy machinery to dig pits on a slope which had a natural grassland. And because of that, the Geological Survey of India, which investigated the mishap, came out with this conclusion that use of heavy machinery and digging pits on in a forested slope, a grassland, caused the landslip. So such cases are very different. So those are serious issues, and that's the reason why habitats must be managed on a scientific basis. There are management plans that have to be vetted by independent ecologists and scientists, and such disastrous prescriptions which can cause damage to habitat or cause a disaster are avoided, like landslips and so forth. And we need to use that kind of knowledge to manage these habitats. But despite that, if natural calamities do play out and there are floods and whatever, nature has a way of taking care of itself. It will recover. In fact, if you say that we should not, in other words, try to play God. Nature has a way of healing itself, and we should allow, because the remedy may be worse than the malady. If we go in and try to do something, somebody will say, oh, we will turf the slope, we'll do this, we'll do that. That will cause more damage. So it will take a long time, it will heal, some damage may remain, but we should not be too concerned. But the causative factor which caused must be investigated. And if there's a real issue with respect to that, that must be addressed.
Right. So we just have one more minute, but I think we can take one last question. The question is, how has the pandemic affected wildlife?
There is a graphic, Ishika, if you can pull it up quickly. It was published in the Lancet, a very respected scientific journal. And that clearly shows that the first step is encroachment into wildlife habitat, change of land use. We talked about this. And that increases the interface between humans and wildlife. And there are many, for example, they have cited Nipah virus and Ebola. We have Kyasanur forest disease in Karnataka and many others. And then it can spread due to international travel trade. The illegal trade in wildlife is second only to narcotics. So a lot of these trade in pangolins, etc., bats, and many other species can trigger the spread of viruses. It can jump from wild animals to humans. So these are recognized things. I'm no expert on COVID or anything of this kind, but this is what I can simply share. And I'm pretty certain that many good scientists are working and trying to enrich our knowledge on how we need to deal with pandemics and zoonosis. And that is a subject which I will not talk more about, and that's what I know.
Right. Sir, thank you so much for your time. I also want to thank the audiences for some really good questions. It's World Rhino Day today, and it was nice to talk to you on a special.
Yeah. So we didn't talk about rhinos. Rhinos are in a precarious situation, and but still the fight is on. And I'm pretty hopeful that the rhino population will further recover. And most importantly, we need those floodplain grasslands to save the rhino.
Right. Yes. Thank you so much, sir. It's always a delight to talk to you. There's always so much learning from you. So I also want to tell the audience who joined later in the later half of the webinar that you can watch the entire webinar on our YouTube channel. So thank you, everyone. Have a great evening. Talk to you again soon, sir.
Thank you. Bye.
Yes.
All the best.
Bye.